we're going to talk about colonialism. And the reason that this comes at this point and not earlier is because it's important to understand that all those other ideas that we talked about in the last couple of weeks are the reason why there are colonies. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution. These are all things that cause the colonies, okay? So the reason that European nations started to send explorers out to establish colonies is because of big changes in the ideologies of Europe. So the reason that we cover those things first is so that we can say Christopher Columbus, for example, was a product of the Renaissance and Reformation. He himself personally was quite a strong product of those movements. He was self-educated in geography and astronomy and history. And even though we celebrate the fact that he got lost and that's why he found the New World, he was actually a really, really intelligent man. He was incredibly intelligent. He was an accomplished sailor and he was an accomplished explorer already. He had already maneuvered around the coast of Africa and come back successfully by the time he set out. But it was because of that, you remember the interaction in the Crusades that revealed all of this ancient documentation that had been preserved by the Islamic countries but thrown out by the Europeans, that was suddenly making its way back into Europe. Well, Marinus of Tyre was one of those people that was an ancient traveler, an ancient theoretical traveler, a geology person who had written down these theories about the size and shape of the world. And Columbus took a look at those and thought that they were really interesting. Marinus of Tyre believed that the equator was about 33,000 kilometers long, which is about 7,000 kilometers too short. Columbus readjusted and thought, well, using that equation, which seemed to make sense given that he had used the position of the moon and drawn a triangle with a protractor and all this kind of stuff in order to establish it, that it made sense incorporating China that the equator was about that long. So if that's the case, then you should be able to set off from Europe and end up in Asia, right? You should be able to set off from here and end up here without too much trouble. So Columbus took these mathematical equations and he figured out the best direction that you would have to go to actually accomplish that. The problem was that Marinus's equations were off by a little bit because they used the size of the moon, which they were guessing. And if the moon is this size and it moves from here and it draws a triangle with this and then repositions it there and then uses this, then this is what you come up with. But if the moon is actually this big and you do the same thing, then the moon is further away than they realized, and therefore bigger than they realized, and therefore the triangle was bigger, which means the equator was bigger, bigger enough by a whole continent, which they were not expecting. So it was all based on really good math for what they knew, and Christopher Columbus was actually using all of those resources when he decided to convince Ferdinand and Isabella to send him west to find a passage to Asia to the west instead of, you know, trying to go around Africa or through the Islamic holdings in the Mediterranean. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella supported him for another one of those Renaissance Reformation reasons. Ferdinand and Isabella had been participating in what was called the Reconquista, which was taking over the entire Iberian Peninsula, which I don't have for you, sorry, but it's this. This is the Iberian Peninsula. You guys are in my way. The Iberian Peninsula. And taking it over and removing all non-Christian influences over an extended amount of time that this had been going on. But Ferdinand and Isabella were individual holders of great big kingdoms inside the Iberian Peninsula, and they were trying to create an entire kingdom out of Spain and then hand it to their son. And nobody was quite sure whether they had the family tree for that, because, you know, the Pope seemed, you know, sort of wishy-washy on it, but they decided that if they had made it a holy enterprise, then not only would the Pope endorse them uniting all of these kingdoms under one peninsula, which would then be in the control of their son, then he would consider that a divine appointment and throw his full support behind this new king. So Ferdinand and Isabella are looking for reasons to do this. Now, the Reconquista actually The fall of Granada actually happens in 1492, as I think Sam pointed out to us, but the complete reconquista of the uniting of all of those kingdoms doesn't take place for another 20 years. But the 1492 is when things need to start showing proof, because they've already taken Granada. Granada has fallen. And was that a holy undertaking? I mean, Granada was a peaceful city where Muslims and Jews and Christians all lived together. So was that a peaceful undertaking or not? Well, there's all this Protestant movement stuff happening in other places, and we don't want that to get messy. So let's reestablish, this as a stronghold of Catholic Christianity right here. And let's send out a mission to prove that we deserve that by giving us also access to Asia. So it's all tangled up in the Renaissance and the Reformation that Columbus gets to go. So Columbus gets to sail west, and what does he discover? When he gets there, he finds an island, which will be Hispaniola, which, this series of islands here are where Christopher Columbus thought that he had found this. Okay, you see this is the map of what he thought he had found. This is the string of islands that he thought he had found. So he makes 4 different voyages across, and very quickly establishes that these are great places to exploit, and that they have their own riches that should be interesting. Markedly pearls, for example. Pearls are something that he finds quite a lot of. But it gives the Spanish a reason to send more. And the Spanish begin to set up a home base here in Cuba, basically, where they can explore further what this big landmass here is and try to figure out how big it is. So over the course of the next 20 years, more, I don't want to call them settlements because they're not really settlements, trading posts, basically, mission exploration posts, come into this area and begin to negotiate with these island people and set up sort of Spanish strongholds there. So here's what the Europeans do when they move into an area. They encounter an established empire that's already there. They bring smallpox with them and the entire population dies. Then they find fractures in that empire. For example, a brother who doesn't like his brother or another relationship, and they exploit that fracture, the tributary empire. I'm sorry? They're really good at stirring the pot. Yeah, they find out what group of people doesn't really like the people in power, and they make friends with those people. They find a fracture in that empire. Then they cut the head off the empire and take it over. Yeah, and then they loot the resources. They set up trading post missions and schools. They infiltrate the entire culture and plant themselves in positions of power throughout that culture, and then they push the population into forced labor. That happens over and over and over and over again in the Americas as European countries arrive. Over and over again it happens. So let's talk about Hernan Cortez as a really good example of exactly this. Okay, so Cortez was, he was working for the governor of Cuba. He was supposed to be an attaché to the governor of Cuba. The governor wanted to send him on a small expedition to the Yucatan, which is just this. This is all it is. He just wanted him to explore this a little bit. That's all. And Cortez had bigger ideas about what he wanted to do. So he took the casual order of the governor to take a ship or two to explore a bit of the Yucatan. And instead, he took 300 men, and he left in a real hurry before the governor could figure out what he was up to. He skipped the Yucatan entirely and landed instead here on the edge of what is basically the Mexican, the Valley of Mexico. The governor immediately suspected that Cortez was up to something and sent soldiers after him. But by this time, Cortez was already burrowing deep into the countryside and trying to find out what was there. So the first social group that he encountered here gave him intelligence as to how their lives were structured around this central empire that was run by the Aztecs. And we talked a little bit at, like, I think it was the second day of class about the Aztecs, how they had moved into this area and that they had become as military as really warriors for hire, and had then risen up the ranks and then established themselves in a city in the middle of the lake, which then grew into a huge tributary empire. That's what he found when he got there. But he found out that that was there by talking to people on the edge who were paying tribute to that empire. So he thought, okay, interesting. He met, for example, do I have her here? I don't know that I do. Oh yeah, I do, here she is. He met the Tabascans, and while he was there, he met a woman who had been traded several times from one tribe to another and therefore spoke several different languages and liked him, which is key. That was Malintzin or La Malinche, depending on which story of her you're hearing. She was a powerful asset to Cortez, who was able to, through her help, negotiate with these tributary peoples who didn't really like the Aztecs that much. So by the time he approached Tenochtitlan, by the time he approached that great big city in the middle of the lake, they'd already heard he was coming. So they rolled out a red carpet for him in the hopes that this would be a fairly simple transaction. Welcome to our fair city. We hope you'll enjoy your stay, which will be short, right? Because there's not that many of you and we're not sure what you're even doing here. There were accounts at one point, mostly in the 1970s, about how the Aztecs expected the arrival of Cortez because it lined up with a prophecy that had to do something about alien landings and stuff like that. I would ask you to be really diligent in setting aside any part of that that might just be guesswork on behalf of people in the 70s. Speaking as somebody who was born in the 70s, they're not always reliable. The city that he found was such a settled structure, and he was only traveling with 300 men, which was more than the governor wanted him to take, but way less than it would take to take over a city like this. He wasn't a threat exactly, they just weren't sure what he wanted, and it seemed like the easiest thing to do was, if the man wants gold, give him gold. We're not eating the gold, we can spare some gold. What he didn't realize, the ruler of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma, what he didn't realize was that hunger for gold was never going to stop, and that because they had found it there, that there would be more Spanish coming. Moctezuma didn't really have a good idea of what Cortez's people were like. He saw them as a small group of explorers that had come in and not as an appendage of a much larger empire. But even so, if the entire force of Spain had decided to attack Tenochtitlan, they couldn't necessarily have won. This was an extremely powerful people, except that they also brought smallpox with them. So, you know, that helped. On November 2nd, Cortez's men and their allies, on November 2nd, 1519, excuse me, approached their new allies with Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma, having heard of him, came out to meet him and welcomed him. After they had a little bit of back and forth, Cortez placed him under house arrest, like you do. He placed him under house arrest and then left him because he had received word that the governor's men were getting awfully close and that he really needed to go out and face them. So he left his own men in charge and went out to face the governor's men to let them know that no, he wasn't going to come back with them to face retribution for leading an exploration that was outside of the realm of his mission. Thank you very much. While he was behind, the Aztec nobles and the men that Cortez had left behind had a fight that ended up with Cortez's men being kicked out of the city, bloodily, violently, in what's called La Noche Trista. Do I have that here? Yeah. In La Noche Trista, they were driven out of the city by Cortez's men were driven out of the city by Moctezuma's men. And many of them were killed. So Cortez spent 10 months planning a counterattack. Now he's going to attack Tenochtitlan. He builds caravels at Veracruz. Caravels are small, fast-moving ships. He builds those. Those are small, fast-moving ships that we brought back from the Crusades, by the way. Interesting technological note. And he made allies among the Tlaxcala, who didn't really like the Aztecs very much. So he led an army of Spaniards on horseback and in caravels and Tlaxcalan allies against the city. And he laid siege to Tenochtitlan for 3 months. He cut off their access to the coast, their access to the land around the lake by cutting off most of their trading roads. And that is a fascinating story. And if this is something that interests you, then we happen to have a teacher here who loves talking about this more than he loves talking about most things. That's Dr. Perry, and he offers this in Voices of the Spanish Conquest, Early Latin American Colonialism, and I think one more, actually. He just loves to talk about this. So if this is a subject that interests you, we actually have a upper division classes you can take, where you can study a lot of this interaction. In 1525, Cortez's men presided over the execution of the Cuauhtémoc, which was now the new emperor, now that Moctezuma was dead. And that was it. Spain now has control of the entire Aztec tributary empire. Cool. So that's what they did. They cut the head off the empire and they took it over. One of Cortez's cousins went to the other side of South America and began an expedition into the Andes, and that was Francisco Pizarro. He arrived and took his men and went to the other side of this peninsula and began down this western coast. Now remember, there's this big spine of mountains that divides North and South America. It starts as the Rockies and ends up as the Andes. And the peoples they grew up differently because of that. So the Incas, as we discussed way a long time ago, they have another kind of tributary empire. It's almost what you would call a communist empire. They have regulation of their resources so that everything goes to the central control and then gets redispersed. And it's very complicated. But it just so happens that when Pizarro lands there, they've just had a battle for succession. They've just had an ugly fight over succession. So he finds himself in the unique position of being able to exploit a leader that is barely hanging on to his ability to lead, because there's a whole faction of other people inside the kingdom that thinks it should have been his brother. So he manages to come in not just with bearing diseases, but also with this war of succession going on right under his feet. So as a show of strength to greet him, Atahualpa meets Francisco Pizarro's men in Cajamarca and sets up kind of a big, beautiful presentation, you might call it. He fills the market square with armed men and comes in a litter himself. And Francisco Pizarro is there with a couple of his men, but a lot of his men have taken up sniper positions. Realizing that this is what was going to happen, they took up sniper positions outside of the market and were able to carry out basically a massacre of Atahualpa's forces. Now, this is after they've tried to negotiate a couple of times with Atahualpa and found out that he had no interest in dealing with them, but that when he finally decided to meet with them, it was going to be in this big, grandiose, look at my military strength against your puny little fiery weapons kind of way. And they thought, well, this is a really easy snip.
They really just played themselves, didn't they?
They really, really did. Yes, this Battle of Cajamarca is not even really a battle, it's just a massacre. They fire into the crowd runs. The litter carriers actually drop the litter and leave Atahualpa floundering on the ground for himself, defending himself. And of course, he is not, he's defenseless because he was not supposed to need weapons himself. This depicts him as having only the sun's scepter. The sun is their sort of overriding god, and the scepter that's all it is. It's just that, it's not a weapon. Important piece of this is this guy here. I don't know, this piece of artwork, this woodcut is not a pro Atahualpa woodcut, it's a pro Francisco Pizarro woodcut. And you can tell by the fact that there is this holy guy that's trying to reason with him that none of this is necessary. Anyway, they shoot into the square and then they ride into the square and then they take Atahualpa prisoner. And so Spain owns now the entire Inca Empire. So they've cut the head off of that and replaced that. The Portuguese send explorers and they land in Brazil. And the Brazil resources are not the same. They go looking for all of the gold and silver, the gold of Tenochtitlan or the silver of Cusco. And what they find instead is just Brazil wood, but lots of it. And Brazil wood becomes really valuable because it makes red wood, which is really pretty on cabinets and really pretty in woodwork, but it also creates a red dye and a dark purple dye that becomes really popular in Europe. So Brazil wood cabinets, Brazil wood doors, Brazil wood being used as dye in your clothing, all that kind of stuff becomes really valuable. It's a sign of wealth. So the Portuguese move into Brazil and begin to immediately create land grants so that they can work the Brazil wood as a cash crop. So the Portuguese do okay in Brazil, and they hold on to a pretty big chunk of South America by holding on to Brazil. There is some resistance to this. There are a couple of people that resisted Spanish and Portuguese raiders, I guess you could say. In Chile, there's a people called the Mapuche who basically just repel every military attack against them until the Spanish basically go, you know what, keep it. We don't need it that bad. We've got so much other land. You can keep your little corner of this. It's just this tiny part of the map here. And it sort of bleeds over into Argentina, but it's a specific tribe that happens to be militarily strong enough to actually repel attacks by the Spanish. So they're like, we're not here to fight. As you said, our method is not to fight. Our method is to chop the head off of something and take it over because of disease. If we have to actually fight for it, we don't want it that bad. So there is a whole group of people here that is descended from people that were never conquered. And they will tell you that if you ask. The other people that resisted were the Ashaninka in the Peruvian rainforest, which is like here. Yeah, I guess this isn't enough of South America that you can see it, but it's here. And the reason is because the rainforest was just too thick. It wasn't worth it to get through it. So they were left alone largely because they were forgotten about. And as a result, they were able to grow without Spanish resistance. After getting rich off of Pizarro's exploits in the Andes, one of his men, Hernando de Soto, asked permission to go north and see what was up there. And so we learned a lot about the De Soto expedition last summer, me and a couple of other students, because we were researching it for Spring Lake Park, which, as you know, is on De Soto Circle and is supposedly the place where De Soto landed. Not landed, but he came through there. He hung one of his men from one of the trees or something. So, you know, famous moment there. And the reason that there is a plaque that says that is because sometime the Daughters of the American Revolution decided that De Soto landed here and drank from the spring and camped.
23 or something.
Yeah, there's no other evidence that he actually did. As a matter of fact, the timing is all wrong. He was dead by the time his expedition would have made it into Spring Lake Park, which I'm not allowed to tell people from Texarkana because they get very upset when they find out that that part of their history is not true. But you can see it for yourself. He started in Florida. He began his expedition. He explored. He went a long way. He continued to look. He was looking for more civilizations like Cuzco, more civilizations like Tenochtitlan, big places with lots of gold. And he just wasn't finding them because if you'll remember, the big civilizations up here, the Mississippian and Caddoan Hopewell cultures had collapsed 10,000 years ago. And they were now just small tribal people. They were not networked as well. They weren't building great big huge worship centers anymore. So he couldn't find the cities that he was looking for. So he kept looking and he kept traveling. At some point he had to, he wandered across the West Coast up into the Appalachians. He had a valuable interpreter, Juan Ortiz, who traveled with him. And when he headed to the Gulf of Mexico to meet some supply ships, he was ambushed and taken prisoner. And then he managed to get away, and it was humiliating. And so rather than go back down to the headquarters in Cuba and report back to the governor what he found, he was like, let's go north again and see if we can find something to redeem us for what has happened here. When he reached the Mississippi, his interpreter died. They tried to get across the Mississippi River, ran into hostile natives, and his interpreter died. And so his expedition tried to return home without him. Of the 750 people who left with De Soto, only 300 returned. And those 300 spread a tale of, there ain't nothing up there worth seeing, and the people are mean, and you shouldn't go, which made it a little hard for people to recruit for further expeditions. The governor of Cuba wanted to send more expeditions up north into this continent that was such a mystery, but he had trouble. So they had trouble finding volunteers as a result of what happened to De Soto's men. We cover this a lot in Cultural History of Texas, just so you know. Eusebio Kino was a Jesuit missionary who had been looking at the map, and he thought that he really wanted this thing where they went through America and ended up in Asia to work. He was really gung-ho that that was still a possibility. So his first assignment outside of his education in Europe was to get assigned to New Spain, was to get assigned to, you know, the governor of Hispaniola out there. And his job was to map this weird long island that was here, that they only really knew a little bit about the southern edge of, and they never found the northern edge of it yet. So if he could just map that little island for them, then that would be an incredibly useful thing. He was a Jesuit, but he was also a cartographer. So map making was one of his jobs. He was a Jesuit, he was a cartographer, and he was a mathematician. He was not a conquistador in any way, shape, or form. But yes?
That mean he couldn't fight?
Not that he couldn't, just that it wasn't his job.
Oh, okay.
But as a general rule, Jesuits did not participate in military activities.
Gotcha.
They actually were kind of really eager to become martyrs instead. Like, that was the most military thing most Jesuits did, was to be like, burn me alive, it'll help, you know. So no, he was definitely not a conquistador. He was very mission based. But he actually tried to tell them, I don't think this is an island. I've looked at the map and I've looked at the patterns of what you guys have already discovered. I've looked at De Soto's writings, which had come back, you know, the expedition had brought some valuable intel. And he says, I don't think this is an island. I think it's a peninsula. And they didn't believe him. It turns out that he was right. That is a peninsula. That is the peninsula on the edge of California, actually. So, but that mapping allowed other missionaries to move into the peninsula and start to establish a presence, which is why your earliest European settlements in California are missions, not, they're missions before they are land grants and encomiendas. They're missions before they're cash crop colonies. They're missions first. Is because it was Eusebio Kino that basically mapped it out. Spain has a very rigid class system at this time. And that rigid class system is something they want to keep. As a matter of fact, they basically take a rigid class system that they have in their own, on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, and they extend it downward so that, you know, there's more categories now, but at the very top is peninsular, somebody who's born on the Iberian Peninsula. And beneath that, there are all different ways that you can be mixed with peninsulars, or a generation past that, born in America, but your parents were both peninsulars. Well, if your parents were born in Spain, but you yourself were born in America, therefore you're in a different bandwidth than the people before you. You are a Creole. If you were born in America but are 100% European, you're a Creole. Not to be confused with the Creoles in like Louisiana. This is a whole separate thing. Yes?
That's what I was going to ask you. Were they the same Creoles in Louisiana?
No, the Creoles in Louisiana are actually a result of the French and Indian War. It's complicated, but they actually come from Canada. So as you begin to mix with the locals and you begin to mix with slaves that were brought in, whoa. Okay, as you begin to mix, there are degrees to which you have a new class, you have a new race. For example, somebody who is a mestizo is European and Native American, somebody who's a mulatto is European and African, and there are degrees of those, so that you can say, well, is it your father that's African and your mother that's Native American, or is it the other way around? Because those are two different things, even though it's the percentages are the same. So they like to break things down into very rigid populations, but there is a lot of mixing of the populations. So that's the two things that we get from this is, one, the further away from African descent you can be, the higher rank you're going to be. But there was a lot of intermixing between African and Native, or Native and European, or European and African. There's a lot of mixing between those races. One of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, with all of this gold and all of this silver pouring in from these major cities, whole empires being taken over by Spain, why did Spain get rich? What happened that made it so that despite all of this bullion pouring into the country, Spain still manages to go bankrupt and be one of the poorest countries in Europe by the 1600s? How does that happen? Well, one of the things is that the colonies are very fixated on military control and colonial regulation and religious conversion. That's what their main goal is. They do have cash crop colonies, which they exploit endlessly, but that's not their main job. Another thing is that because of this class system here, they don't want people born in the Americas to become richer than people who were born in the peninsulas. So people actually born in Spain still need to be the richest people in Spain. You can't have somebody who is a kid of two people who are born in Spain, who grows up in New Spain, in the Americas, establishing himself as a rich person with land grants that are very prosperous, becoming more rich than the nobles in Spain. We can't have that. So we begin to see Spain cutting down on raising taxes and lowering the possibility of income on landed lords in New Spain. They actually inhibit the economic development to make sure that Spain stays on top. Even if that means that Spain continuously sinks, they're still going to be on top of it. So they prohibit manufacturing, they prohibit trade. Everything has to go through Spain. If they create it in the colonies, it needs to stay in the colonies. We're not going to trade it with other countries. And towns are prevented from growing into bigger towns. They stay land grants. So that's as opposed to what happens with the English and the French colonies, which is very different. I still got some time. We're probably more familiar with the English colonies than we are with the New Spanish colonies, wouldn't you say? Like overall, we know more about those original 13 colonies than we do about anything that happened in New Spain. So I can cover this pretty quickly. The English had the same desires as everybody else as far as why to have colonies in America. They wanted a Northwest Passage. That was the biggest thing. Everybody wants a Northwest Passage, a way to get through from Europe to Asia by going through America. That's the biggest first thing. They want cash crops. There are things that grow in America that do not grow anywhere in Europe. There are livestock that thrive in America that don't have the space to thrive in Europe. And there are things that you can produce and hunt. There are animals that you can hunt. So beaver, indigo, tobacco, pork for some reason. There are a lot of wild pork creatures in America that didn't exist, as opposed to like horses and cows, which they had to bring in, which they did in vast numbers. So the Dutch sent an explorer through to find a Northwest Passage, Henry Hudson, to find a Northwest Passage in 1606. So if you do the math, Hernan Cortez went to Tenochtitlan in 1519. And this is 1606. So we're talking about almost 100 years of Spanish colonies by the time Northern Europe starts to send to North America to set up colonies. The earliest Dutch settlements were focused on trade. They weren't settled on having families and building villages. They were fur traders who were there individually, oftentimes in very small groups, and their whole goal was fur trade. So the first real establishment of an attempt to actually have a colony with like a settlement with like families was New Netherlands. And that was established right on the river, on the Hudson River. The Dutch West India Company established itself specifically to do this North American trade of fur. And it had its base right there in what is now New York, right on the Hudson River. Most of the English colonies are formed as a result of that religious splintering that we saw in the Reformation. If a group is going to gain power in England or in Europe at all, in England specifically, then it should be a group that has the same religious values. So if you're talking about the people with their alliance to the Catholic Church, then those should be Catholic, or not Catholic colonies, but Anglican colonies, which is not Catholic, except they kind of, anyway, whatever. If you want Puritans to have control in Parliament, then Puritans need to have colonies. And so we get these splintered colonies in England that are the result of different religious groups. The Jamestown, which is the first English colony that actually works. And the only reason it works is because of a fluke of a guy who had tobacco seeds in his pocket. James Rolfe had tobacco seeds from Bermuda in his luggage when he was living in Jamestown and decided to see if they would grow in Virginia. And of course, they're tobacco seeds, so of course they grew. And Virginia turned out to be much better for them than Bermuda was. And so they flourished and turned Jamestown into a cash crop colony. Before that, it was falling apart because they were not very well managed. But they came from the crown. The crown established Jamestown. It established the joint stock company that created Jamestown. So they were people that were loyal to the crown. At the same time, like 10 years, within the next 10 years, the Puritans also began to establish themselves as colonies in Massachusetts Bay. So up here, you've got colonies that are being established by Puritans, and down here you have colonies that are being established by Anglicans. And that was a big part of the reason why there was difference between the English colonies. The French came a different direction when they established their, when they moved up into the colonies. They came down through Quebec and up through the Mississippi. Based on the readings of Hernando de Soto's explorations, they were like, we want to see this big river and we want to see what it entails. They actually had explorers, La Salle, who figured out that if you went into that river that goes through Quebec and traced it all the way down, you can make it all the way out the southern coast. That this was a river that actually went the whole continent. That if France could just control that whole river, then they would control the main artery of the whole continent. So they began to establish their colonies on that basis. They had their own religious wars. They had Protestants and Catholics fighting with each other on French land, looking for safe haven. So they had people that went over to their colonies for religious reasons. Just like England, they were trying to find a Northwest Passage. Their explorer's name was Giovanni de Verenzano, and he didn't find one either. And just like England, they had a colony that started on a river and didn't work, just like Roanoke started and didn't work for the English. But so their pattern of colonization is very similar to Europe's pattern of colonization. They land, they figure out if they can establish a cash crop. They either do or don't. They make peace with the locals. The French formed an alliance. They moved in just in time for a battle between different tribes and took a side, and therefore were able to provide assistance to that side and have an ally, and that was the Huron. So the French established allies pretty much right away. But most of the French colonies are directly controlled by the crown. They're not joint stock companies. They're not established by splinter religious groups, and they're established and controlled directly by the crown. So there's no local authority in the colonies at all. And they're mostly based on fur trading. So they're not there to settle families and grow and establish a presence. They're there to establish industry. So ultimately what's going to happen by about the mid-1700s is that England and France are going to have been enriched by their colonies. Their colonies are going to make them rich, whereas Spain is going to be going into bankruptcy, despite the fact that the Spanish colonies are established right on top of extremely fruitful empires with gold and bullion and silver and all kinds of things that they can immediately turn around and that has massive purchasing power. But the English colonies and the French colonies, which are cash crop colonies and family settling, ventures, are going to end up being more lucrative. And the countries, England and France, are going to be richer as a result than Spain is. Then both of them are going to end up richer than Spain. So my question for you is to take a look at that whole trend and answer the question. Let me get into it. Hold on. Excuse me. Okay, Spain discovered all kinds of gold and silver and other valuables, but within 100 years, Spain was practically bankrupt. England settled colonies that had little to no wealth, and within a century were one of the richest countries in Europe thanks to their colonies. What practices made the English colonies in America financially helpful to England that were not employed by the Spanish? So your job is to try to suss out why the English colonies were so fruitful, what the Spanish did that made their colonies not as beneficial to Spain. The English colonies were fruitful to England. Why weren't the Spanish colonies fruitful to Spain? Okay, anybody have any questions? And it can be your best guess. I'm just kind of interested in what you find. But that's your assignment, and that's due 11:59 p.m. on Sunday.